Sometimes the day ends before a decision does. The room is quiet, the light is off, and still one choice keeps moving. A marriage accepted too quickly, a job taken from fear and called practicality, a silence kept because speaking would have changed too much. From inside the moment it felt like choosing. At night, another thought arrives beside it. The fear was already there, the need to please was already there, the habit of delaying pain was already there. More of the past was present in the choice than the choice itself was willing to admit. That is one of the oldest reasons human beings have spoken about fate. Not because they wanted stars, prophecies, or secret messages, but because they noticed something unnerving in ordinary life. We act, and yet we are acted through. We make plans, and yet temperament, memory, desire, injury, family pattern, social pressure, and sheer circumstance are already leaning on the scale before the mind says yes or no. The old argument about free will begins there, in that uneasy overlap between authorship and inheritance. Tonight, I do not want to solve that argument or soothe it into a slogan. The Stoics will help, but not in the thin way they are often quoted. Tragedy will help, because it shows how action can be real even when knowledge is partial and conditions are inherited. Modern debates about determinism, compatibilism, blame, and responsibility will help too. But first the question has to be left intact. So let me say plainly what this night is for. By the end of tonight, I want to leave you with a calmer and more exact way to think about choice, when so much of the self that chooses was never made freely. If you enjoy thinking through questions like this with me, subscribing to the channel helps others find them too. Sharing the video helps even more. Let's begin. There are decisions that look finished from the outside and unfinished from within. A signature is on the paper. The move happened 3 years ago. The apology was never made. The friendship cooled and then turned into one of those facts no one announces and everyone feels. Daily life learns how to move around the event. Then night comes and the event is alive again, not because the mind enjoys suffering, but because darkness removes the little distractions that normally keep old questions away. What returns is not always simple regret. Regret at least suggests a cleaner alternative. It says, another path was available, and you failed to take it. The more troubling feeling is mixed. Responsibility is there, because the hand was yours, the sentence was yours, the refusal was yours. Yet another mood sits beside it. The decision also seems to have been waiting for you. It matches the shape of your fear too perfectly. It fits your old loyalties, your old hunger, your usual evasions, the parts of your nature that show up before reflection has time to put on its coat. It can begin to feel less like one isolated act and more like a whole character briefly becoming visible. That does not prove anything. It does not prove determinism. It does not prove fate. It does not prove that freedom is an illusion. But it does reveal why the problem refuses to stay in textbooks. The mind is not only asking whether an action happened, it is asking what kind of action it was. Did the act come from a free self, from a frightened self, from a self already shaped long before that afternoon or that evening? Was the decision chosen, or was it the natural continuation of a person formed by causes that were never put to a vote? This is where an ordinary distinction helps. Many philosophers separate free action from free will. Free action asks whether someone was physically prevented, coerced, or forced. Free will asks something more intimate. Even if no one held your arm, did the wanting itself belong to you in a deep enough sense? If no external wall stopped the act, where did the inner push come from? The difference matters, because a life can look voluntary on the outside and still feel inherited on the inside. Suppose a person takes a position at work because it promises safety, status, and a pleasing answer to other people's expectations. Nothing in the visible scene looks violent. No one drags them to the desk. No law requires the acceptance. Years later, the same person lies awake and notices that almost every force that made the decision attractive was old. The habit of fearing instability, the need to be admired, the belief that rest must be earned through overwork, the family memory of scarcity, the inability to disappoint authority. The action was not externally forced, yet the will itself no longer appears fresh and sovereign, it appears historical. That is why the replay can be so difficult to bear. If the choice had been obviously imposed, resentment would have a clear target. If it had been obviously free, the mind might condemn itself cleanly and move on. Instead, the event belongs to that painful middle terrain where the act was genuinely yours, and yet the self who acted was crowded with unchosen influences. Night listening has a strange honesty about this. In daylight, a person can say, "I did what I thought was best," and the sentence may be true enough to carry them forward. Midnight asks a harsher follow-up. What made that seem best? What trained your attention to land there? What made one danger intolerable and another invisible? Which parts of the decision were recent and which were ancient? The point is not to enlarge guilt until it swallows all peace. The point is to see why human beings have never been satisfied with a shallow picture of choice. Action looks simple only when we isolate the final moment from everything that prepared it. Once the frame widens, the chooser becomes part of the question. There is a quiet relief hidden in that wider frame, though it is not the relief of innocence. Many people suffer because they keep trying to narrate one action with a picture of the self that was never true. They tell the story as if a fully transparent person stood before two perfectly visible roads and selected one in pure daylight. When memory refuses that picture, they think memory is broken. Often memory is doing something more useful. It is reporting that the self who chose was conflicted, trained, hungry, frightened, proud, half awake, eager to be approved, or tired of enduring tension. The more exact story may hurt dignity at first. It also creates the first chance to stop worshipping a false version of freedom. It also changes what regret is for. Regret is not only a private courtroom where the past is sentenced again and again. Sometimes regret is the mind's late attempt to become literate in its own motives. It goes back because it wants to understand how one sentence came so easily, why one warning sounded small, why one kind of love felt safer than another. That backward movement can become self-torment, but it can also become knowledge. And knowledge matters here because if the self that chose has a history, then the next choice will not be changed by shame alone. It will be changed only by seeing more clearly what has been making certain outcomes feel natural. This is also why some decisions seem to divide a life into before and after, even when nothing dramatic was visible at the time. The act itself may have lasted seconds. The preparation for it may have lasted 20 years. A person says yes to the wrong promise because the sound of being needed is stronger than the sound of being respected. Another says no to a possibility because the body has learned to treat uncertainty as danger. Another keeps silent because in childhood truth was expensive. The final gesture belongs to the present. Its emotional grammar is often much older. In that sense, a replayed choice becomes a kind of document. It shows not only what happened, but what sort of self had been assembled by then. A single event can expose appetite, fear, vanity, loyalty, exhaustion, and private superstition all at once. That is painful knowledge, but it is still knowledge. A mind that notices this is not only brooding, it is discovering that biography enters deliberation. What feels like one clean instant of freedom often contains a whole education in miniature. There is another difficulty hidden in these replays. The mind often edits memory to protect a cleaner self-image. It remembers one dramatic yes, but forgets the month of soft compromises before the yes. It remembers one silence, but forgets the smaller silences that made the final silence feel almost natural. It remembers the decisive evening, but not the weeks in which avoidance kept postponing truth until avoidance itself became the decision. A replayed choice is often a replay of delay. The final act becomes intelligible only when those earlier permissions are allowed back into view. And that is the first philosophical shift this subject asks of us. Fate is not yet a doctrine here. It is not yet Zeus, providence, nature, or laws of motion. It begins as a disturbance in self-understanding. Something in us senses that a decision may be both deliberate and deeply prepared. We remember saying yes or no. We also begin to suspect that more was already in the room than conscious intention. If that suspicion is real, then the next step cannot be another speech about taking responsibility or trusting the universe. The problem has to be named more carefully than that. Before asking whether life is written, it helps to ask what people mean when they speak of fate at all. The word fate is useful because it is vague. That is also what makes it dangerous. It gathers several different fears under one short sound. Sometimes it means prophecy, as if the future were already known by a god or an oracle. Sometimes it means fatalism, the belief that certain outcomes will happen no matter what anyone does. Sometimes it means social inheritance, the sense that class, family, country, and history handed us a script before we could read. Sometimes it means tragedy, where character and ignorance carry a person toward a consequence they cannot fully see. And sometimes, in modern language, it stands in for causal determinism, the idea that what happens later is fixed by earlier states of the world, together with the laws of nature. These are not the same thing. If they are allowed to blur into one another, the mind becomes vulnerable to cheap comfort and cheap despair at once. Cheap comfort says everything happened for a reason, as if every loss arrived wrapped in a private message meant to reassure. Cheap despair says nothing matters, as if causes erase effort by definition. Both mistakes thrive when the language stays muddy. Fatalism is one of the oldest versions of the fear. On a fatalistic picture, some event will occur regardless of what anyone attempts. The train is missed no matter how early one leaves. The king dies no matter how fiercely the guards stand watch. Action becomes theatrically present but logically irrelevant. This is why fatalism feels suffocating. It empties effort out before effort begins. Causal determinism is different. In its plainest form, it says that given the state of the world at one time and the laws of nature, the later state is fixed. That sounds cold, but notice what it does not say. It does not say the future is meaningful in a personal, cosmic sense. It does not say events are foreordained by intention. It does not say human effort is idle. In a deterministic story, effort is part of the chain. Deliberation is part of the chain. Regret, apology, training, persuasion, exhaustion, fear, concentration, and habit are all part of the chain. The fact that they have causes does not make them unreal. It only places them within a wider order. This distinction matters because many people hear the claim that choices have causes and immediately translate it into, then what I do changes nothing. But the deterministic picture, if true, would not say that. It would say what you do changes things precisely because what you do is one of the things through which later events are caused. A person studies and therefore passes. A person drinks and therefore crashes the car. A friend speaks honestly and therefore interrupts a long pattern of avoidance. Causes are not an argument against consequence. They are how consequence happens. This is easier to hear in ordinary life than in abstract argument. If a doctor says a person's illness has causes, no sane listener concludes that treatment is pointless. The diagnosis is precisely what explains why treatment matters. If a marriage has grown cold through years of silence, habit, fatigue, and mutual defense, no one improves it by declaring the pattern uncaused. The work begins by seeing the pattern as a pattern. Cause does not remove responsibility from the scene. It tells us what kind of scene we are in. Another confusion lies close by. A determined world need not be predictable in practice. Finite creatures do not stand outside the universe with perfect access to every prior condition and every law. Human uncertainty remains real. A caused life can still surprise the very person living it. That is one reason this question feels so intimate. We are inside the process, not above it. The future may be fixed and still hidden, or it may not be fixed at all. Either way, ignorance is part of the human condition. Once that is clear, the word fate can be handled with more discipline. Sometimes fate is an ordinary word for the felt weight of living in a life already shaped by many things not chosen. That use is understandable, but if we are going to think rather than drift, we have to keep separating the strands. Mystical destiny is one strand, fatalism is another. Determinism is another. Tragic necessity is another. Social inheritance is another. Habit and character formation are another. The fact that all of them can make a life feel given does not mean they do the same work. This becomes especially important when the word fate is used to hide from embarrassment. A person says fate because fate sounds larger and nobler than fear. Another says fate because fate sounds cleaner than class, dependency, habit, or social reward. Another says fate because fatalistic language can disguise the smaller truth that effort was surrendered too early. Once the meanings are separated, evasion becomes harder. If the issue was fatalism, the question is whether one abandoned action. If the issue was tragedy, the question is what was not seen in time. If the issue was determinism, the question is how a caused life can still contain distinction. If the issue was inheritance, the question is which patterns were passed forward under the name of personality. Social inheritance deserves special care because it is often mistaken either for destiny or for excuse. A child who grows up in a house where apology never happens enters adulthood with a damaged sense of what repair sounds like. A child raised under permanent money fear may feel every risk as threat long after conditions improve. Someone formed under contempt may experience tenderness as danger because tenderness once led to humiliation. None of that is mystical, it is historical. Yet historical forces can feel just as binding as any prophecy when they have lived in the body long enough. Calling them fate may be emotionally understandable. Thinking well requires the harder language of formation, reward, fear, and repetition. That harder language does not flatten life into sociology either. Two siblings can inherit the same house and carry different laws out of it. One becomes hyper-responsible and frightened of disorder. Another becomes allergic to control and drifts towards self-sabotage whenever structure appears. Shared conditions do not create identical souls. The point is not to replace cosmic script with mechanical simplification. The point is to admit that between the stars and the self there are many smaller powers at work, and most of them wear ordinary clothes. Precision does not remove fear, it keeps fear from lying. And that matters because the free will debate is often made ridiculous, either by mystical inflation or by flattening every form of necessity into one grey block. Clearer language makes room for clearer responsibility. The next question, once that clarity is won, is whether anything remains truly ours inside a life so crowded with causes. The Stoics gave one of the oldest serious answers to that. Epictetus begins from a distinction many people think they already understand, and then discovers they do not. Some things are up to us, he says, and some things are not. At first this sounds almost childish. Of course some things are in our control and some are not. But the difficulty appears the moment one asks where to draw the line. Is health ours when a fragile body can dominate a day? Is reputation ours when damaged reputation can cost work, belonging, and safety? Are emotions ours when they can arrive before permission? Among the things in our control, he includes opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion, and our own actions. Among the things not in our control, he places the body, property, reputation, and office. He is not saying these things are unimportant. He is saying they are not ours in the same way judgment is ours. A broken leg hurts whether one agrees to it or not. A rumor spreads through other mouths, not ours. A storm does not consult preference before arriving. If the mind treats such things as though they were sovereign possessions, it ties peace to what can never be finally held. This is a hard teaching because it does not flatter emotion. It asks for an inward sorting that feels almost small beside major suffering. Yet small is not the same as trivial. The Stoic wager is that judgment is the place where a human being can still participate ethically in a world that outruns desire. The key term is assent. Impressions arrive, an insult is heard, a face is remembered. The stomach tightens at a familiar kind of silence. Before philosophy comes in to help, there is already appearance, already movement, already the first touch of an event upon the mind. Epictetus does not pretend these first touches are chosen. What matters is what the mind does next. It can hurry to endorse the impression as the whole truth, or it can pause and examine. That pause is not omnipotence. It is not a button that turns grief into grace. It is not a trick for becoming immune to humiliation or loss. Stoic texts are often damaged by readers who treat them as a technology of invulnerability. Read more carefully and a more serious picture appears. The first freedom is not dominance over reality. It is a disciplined refusal to let appearance instantly become verdict. Anyone who has watched anxiety make a small event gigantic knows why this matters. A delayed message can become rejection before there is evidence. One awkward meeting can become a prophecy of collapse. A memory can become a total story about what kind of person one is. Much misery comes not only from events, but from premature agreement with what events seem to say. The importance of this becomes even clearer when the event is morally charged. Suppose you hurt someone, and the first thought that rises is, "I am hopeless, so there is no point trying to repair this." That thought may feel humble because it sounds self-accusing. In reality, it can be another way of refusing responsibility. If the self is declared ruined at once, the long work of apology, restitution, altered habit, and patient truth can be avoided. Stoic discipline interrupts not only self-flattering impressions, but also self-condemning ones, when condemnation becomes another form of vanity. There is a practical austerity in this that many modern ears resist. We are accustomed to thinking that if a feeling is strong enough, it must also be authoritative. Epictetus keeps separating strength from truth. Panic can be strong and false. Shame can be strong and misleading. Pleasure can be strong and destructive. The mere vividness of an inner state does not settle what should be done with it. It also explains why Stoic training is repetitive. No one learns once and then simply has it. The distinction between what is and is not up to us has to be remembered when the body is tired, when grief is active, when envy is whispering, when public embarrassment narrows attention, when pain makes all philosophy seem insulting. The work is not abstract classification, but repeated return. Each return is a way of refusing to hand final authority to the loudest impression in the room. So when Epictetus divides what is up to us from what is not, he is not offering a pep talk. He is redefining ethical labor. The world will continue delivering body, weather, rumor, poverty, illness, insult, and death, without waiting for our consent. The better question is where in all of that a person still takes part as a judge, rather than only as an object struck. This is why the Stoic answer can feel both modest and severe. Modest because the space it protects is inward and often narrow. Severe because it refuses to let judgment be fully excused by circumstance. The mind may be burdened, tired, frightened, socially constrained, or badly trained. None of that disappears. Yet Epictetus still asks what happens when appearance meets appraisal. That tiny crossing is where responsibility begins for him. Many readers want something easier. They want Stoicism to say that externals do not matter, so pain can be dismissed. Or they want it to say that internal control is absolute, so mastery can be promised. It says neither. It says a person may fail, may be wounded, may be shaken, and still not be relieved of the task of judgment. That is also why Epictetus can feel almost rude to a modern listener in pain. He will not let injury automatically settle interpretation. Yet he does not ask the injured person to lie either. If you lose work, the loss is real. If your body gives way, the weakness is real. If someone betrays you, the betrayal is real. The discipline begins after that admission. What will the event now be allowed to mean? Will it become proof that all trust is foolish? Will it become permission to imitate the injury? Or will it remain what it is, painful, serious, finite, and not yet a final description of the soul? That is why Stoic writing so often sounds like a person talking themselves down from exaggeration, rather than a teacher unveiling a secret. The mind loves total language. This ruined everything. This proves what I am. This embarrassment will never stop speaking. Stoic discipline asks whether the event was terrible or whether the interpretation made it more total than truth requires. Sometimes the answer will be painful. A death really does take someone away. A dismissal can alter the structure of a life. But even there, the event is not automatically every conclusion the mind builds on top of it. That task becomes more interesting when placed beside fate. If the world is ordered by causes, if much of what reaches us is never chosen, then the Stoic line is not an escape from the chain. It is an attempt to identify where the chain passes through a rational creature capable of endorsement or refusal. The next step is to look more closely at that passage. Imagine an insult spoken in a tired voice at the end of a long day. The words enter quickly. Heat rises just as quickly. By the time the mind begins to narrate, the body is already involved. Pulse has changed. Memory has joined the scene. Some older wound has recognized its chance. In ordinary speech, one says, "I got angry." The Stoics invite a slower description. An impression arrived, a movement followed, then the mind either endorsed a certain reading of the event or did not. That may sound too delicate to matter, but the whole Stoic picture of agency depends on it. Chrysippus was willing to say that human actions are causally determined and still somehow up to us. How could that be? Because for the Stoic, what matters is not whether action came from nowhere, but whether it came through the person as a rational and charactered being, rather than through sheer external compulsion alone. A famous image associated with Stoic discussion compares external impulse and internal nature to pushing a cylinder. The push begins motion, but the cylinder rolls according to its shape. The image has limits, and no one should mistake a human being for a passive object. Still, the point is useful. Causes work through what a thing is. In human life, that means an event does not simply hit an empty chamber. It passes through perception, memory, judgment, training, fear, expectation, and habits built into the person over time. This is why a caused action does not look the same as a forced action. If a hand is physically moved by another hand, the person is not the root of judgment in the same way. But if an event is taken up by one's own beliefs, motives, and endorsements, the person is implicated from within. The action can be caused and still be meaningfully theirs, not because they stood outside nature, but because nature included a reasoning animal whose judgments were part of the process. That is a demanding view. It does not let us hide in a fantasy of pure spontaneity. It also does not permit the easier despair that says, "Because I was caused, none of this touches me." Stoic agency is not clean. It is entangled. The mind is both a recipient and a participant. At the same time, this account leaves a difficult wound exposed. If the judgment passes through character, where did character come from? Education, class, childhood danger, bodily vulnerability, social praise, repeated humiliation, remembered love, remembered neglect, ordinary reinforcement. Once those influences are seen, the Stoic picture becomes more impressive and less comforting. It preserves a place for agency without pretending that the person exercising agency was self-created. That tension is exactly why the phrase "control your reaction" fails as a summary. It makes the Stoic move sound like a simple command to exercise inner sovereignty. But reactions do not appear in a vacuum, and not every mind has equal access to calm inspection. Fatigue narrows options. Fear speeds endorsement. Habit makes one interpretation arrive before alternatives. A person shaped by long alarm may assent too quickly to danger. Another shaped by flattery may assent too quickly to vanity. The inner domain is not a spotless court, it is a weathered place. One reason this matters so much at night is that sleep loss exposes how thin the fantasy of perfect control always was. A person may know in daylight that one comment from a stranger should not define them. Then tiredness comes, and the same comment expands until it seems to explain the whole life. The Stoic point is not that the tired mind has failed uniquely. The point is that the mind always needed training, and fatigue reveals how badly training is needed. The weathered place shows its cracks most clearly when energy is low. Yet for the Stoics, weathered is enough. The task is not to become a god looking down at one's passions from perfect order. The task is to become less reckless in agreement. One can ask of an impression, is this the thing itself, or only how it first appears? Is this event unbearable, or only painful? Is this insult proof of worthlessness, or evidence that another person is unsteady, cruel, or afraid? Notice what this does to the question of fate. Fate, on this account, does not abolish participation, it frames it. The world sends impressions and circumstances according to a larger order. The individual cannot cancel that order, but the individual's judgments are among the ways the order works itself out. Many modern listeners resist that because it seems to reduce freedom to something small. Perhaps it does reduce the dream of absolute freedom. But small is not the same as imaginary. A person's assent can decide whether anger grows teeth, whether fear becomes obedience, whether grief turns into bitterness, whether humiliation hardens into contempt. Those are not tiny differences inside a life. They are often the shape of a life. One can hear this more clearly by thinking of the same event received under different judgments. A friend forgets a promise. One mind immediately says, "I never matter to anyone," and from there grows cold. Another says, "This was careless and needs to be named," and remains capable of speech. The forgotten promise is the same. The ethical world built around it is not. Stoic assent lives in that difference. It does not erase the wound. It determines whether the wound becomes the master interpreter of everything else. The same holds when the event is inward rather than social. A tired person notices envy, lust, resentment, or cowardice in themselves, and may instantly produce one of two false verdicts. The first says, "This passing state reveals my eternal essence." The second says, "Because it arose, I must obey it." Stoic examination rejects both. A movement in the soul can be real without being sovereign. It can be morally important without becoming the whole identity. That restraint is not coldness. It is one of the few ways a person keeps from being drafted by every force that passes through them. This is also where Stoicism begins to resemble a discipline of source-checking for the soul. Before anger becomes identity, before fear becomes command, before humiliation becomes metaphysics, the mind is asked to ask what it is agreeing to, not whether it feels strongly, but whether the conclusion attached to the feeling deserves loyalty. Still, Stoicism is not the whole story. It is strongest when the question is, what am I agreeing to right now? It becomes less complete when the harder question is, what if my way of seeing was formed before I ever learned to inspect it? That is where tragedy enters. Marcus Aurelius is often treated as though he was standing on a stage, delivering Stoic commands to modern achievers. In reality, he is more interesting when heard as a tired man writing to himself. The emperor's authority matters less here than the fact that power did not rescue him from mortality, irritation, fragility, or self-reproach. The meditations are not public speeches of victory. They are reminders meant for an unstable mind. This makes Marcus especially fitting for the night. He speaks from inside the same human fact the listener knows well. One part of the self understands what is reasonable, while another part keeps slipping back into resentment, vanity, impatience, fear, and distraction. Philosophy in Marcus is not a polished theory first. It is repeated orientation. Again and again, the meditations return to scale. People praise and blame for a moment, then vanish. The body ages. Death is near, whether thought lingers on it or not. The world changes too quickly to justify vanity and too regularly to justify surprise. When Marcus tells himself to meet what comes according to nature, the phrase is not a slogan about winning composure. It is a way of resisting the fantasy that one can build a permanent self from reputation, power, or mood. One of his most severe reminders is that death is always close enough to discipline the present. He tells himself, in different forms, that he could leave life now and therefore ought to let that fact govern what he says, thinks, and does. Read badly, that sounds grim. Read carefully, it is a rescue from postponement. If life is fragile, then vanity becomes a foolish use of limited time, delay becomes harder to romanticize, spite begins to look expensive. Mortality for Marcus is not only an end, it is a lens that strips false importance from many of the dramas by which people exhaust themselves. Another recurring movement in Marcus is his morning preparation for difficult people. He expects to meet the meddling, the ungrateful, the arrogant, the deceptive. That list is not there to make him superior. It is there so he does not keep pretending that human pettiness is a shocking interruption of the moral order. He wants to remember in advance that other people will arrive burdened by ignorance, self-love, fear, confusion, and appetite. This does not excuse injustice. It lowers the surprise that turns every encounter into personal persecution. Fate becomes easier to bear when one stops demanding that the world contain only reasonable souls. He also keeps returning to the possibility of an inward retreat, though that phrase can be misunderstood. He does not mean private fantasy or elegant detachment from duty. He means that the mind can be recalled from gossip, grievance, and performance long enough to recover its measure. A person in power is in special danger here because the world keeps rewarding self-importance. Marcus writes against that intoxication. But the warning belongs to ordinary life too. Any of us can begin living as if our irritation were proof of significance. Any of us can act as though being offended gives us rank. His self-address keeps cutting through that illusion. He matters for this topic because he makes fate intimate without making it sentimental. Fate in Marcus is not a private script specially written to flatter the individual soul. It is the larger order into which each life is briefly folded. To remember that order is not to feel specially protected. It is often to feel smaller, more temporary, and more accountable. That is why Marcus can sound both consoling and unsparing. Consoling because he asks the mind to stop enlarging what it cannot finally keep. Unsparing because he keeps returning the person to duty. Act justly, speak truthfully. Do not let anger make you resemble the thing you resent. The world is unstable. That is not a license to become careless. Impermanence is not an excuse for ethical laziness. There is also something important in his tone. Marcus does not write like a man who believes he has solved suffering. He writes like a man who has to remember, and remember again. That repeated self-address guards the Stoic lane from distortion. A philosophy that must be rehearsed this often is not a cheap possession. It is a discipline against forgetfulness. That repeated rehearsal matters because it shows how agency often survives, not as one great victory, but as returning after irritation, returning after self-pity, returning after ambition has swollen and made the whole day sound louder than it is, returning after grief has tried to turn one loss into the structure of the whole world. Marcus is valuable for sleepless minds because he does not hide the embarrassment of needing to come back to the same truths. He assumes that human beings leak wisdom faster than they acquire it. Under fate, maintenance becomes one of the real forms of freedom. In the context of fate and agency, Marcus helps us hear a difficult truth. Sometimes what remains ours is not a triumphant act of self-creation, but the quality of attention and conduct with which we meet what time is assigned. The task is not to erase necessity. The task is to live within necessity without becoming base. He also reminds us that inward discipline does not abolish outer tragedy. An emperor can work on judgment and still not negotiate with death. He can restrain vanity and still watch plague, war, and political distortion move through the world he inhabits. He can tell himself not to be ruled by praise and still feel the sting of criticism. This matters because it keeps Stoicism from shrinking into emotional management. Marcus does not claim that self-command makes the world harmless. He claims only that without self-command, the world recruits the soul too quickly into panic, vanity, and spite. There is a scene implied throughout the Meditations, a person pausing before the mind runs away with itself. Not a sage floating above conditions, but a finite person trying not to let each passing disturbance become character. That scene belongs to the free will problem more than it first appears. It shows agency as maintenance rather than miracle. It shows that what is morally significant may sometimes be the effort not to hand total authority to the first impulse. Marcus therefore occupies a useful place in this argument. He keeps the listener close to inward labour while quietly preparing them for the admission that inward labour is not the whole story. A person can be diligent, sincere, and morally serious, and still be enclosed by limits no amount of self-address fully removes. Once that is admitted, Greek tragedy no longer looks like a decorative addition. It looks like the next necessary pressure. When people speak casually about Oedipus, they often say he was doomed from the start, as though the point of the play was simply that prophecy beats effort, that summary misses what makes tragedy unsettling. Oedipus is not passive. He does not sit in a chair while destiny performs itself around him. He rules, investigates, suspects, commands, promises, curses, and insists on knowing the truth. The action of the play is powered by his agency. That is why it hurts. At the start of Sophocles' drama, Thebes is suffering from plague, and Oedipus behaves as a responsible ruler. He sends Creon to ask Apollo what must be done. He receives the answer that the pollution of an old murder must be uncovered. He does not shrug and say that if the gods have decided, there is nothing to do. He commits himself to pursuit. He speaks and acts as someone taking responsibility for the city. The tragedy deepens because the investigation is not fake. It is real inquiry under real ignorance. Oedipus wants the truth. He follows clues. He questions witnesses. He grows angry, suspicious, proud, desperate. Each step is intelligible. Each step is also part of a pattern he cannot yet see. Agency and necessity do not cancel each other. They interlock. This matters because it gives flesh to an otherwise abstract worry. Human beings do not only suffer from forces outside action, they also suffer from acting on partial knowledge. A person marries without understanding what in them seeks rescue through dependence. A leader doubles down on a failing policy because admitting uncertainty would threaten identity. A parent repeats a coldness they swore they had escaped because, in the moment, it feels like steadiness. The tragedy is not inactivity. The tragedy is action routed through blindness. Aristotle later gave a language for why such stories strike us so deeply. Reversal, recognition, pity, fear. We watch a person move toward consequence through a mix of character, error, and circumstance, and we feel both that events make sense and that they exceed intention. Tragedy does not teach that people are puppets. It teaches that agency can be genuine and still not be enough to master inherited conditions, missing knowledge, and the hidden architecture of a situation. It also teaches that discovery can arrive too late to save innocence. Recognition in tragedy is painful not only because facts are exposed, but because the exposed facts reorganize everything that came before them. An ordinary human version of this happens whenever a person realizes that what they called devotion was dependency, what they called principle was injured pride, or what they called prudence was fear of humiliation. The action was real while it was happening. Later knowledge does not erase the action, it changes its moral shape. This is why Oedipus belongs in a conversation about fate more than any easy maxim does. Prophecy in the play is not only a magical spoiler about what will happen, it is the dramatic form in which limits on self-knowledge become unbearable. Oedipus does not know who he is in the way that matters most. He acts from that ignorance. He is intelligent and energetic, and yet those very qualities help bring the hidden pattern to light. If one listens calmly, tragedy says something severe about human freedom. The issue is not only whether we choose. We do. The issue is how often we choose from within a field whose dimensions we do not know. Character itself can be the road along which necessity travels. Pride can do it. Courage can do it. Loyalty can do it. Even a sincere commitment to justice can do it, if knowledge is partial enough. That is one reason tragedy feels closer to life than abstract blame often does. Most human failures are not committed while the person inwardly narrates, "I now choose evil." They are committed while some narrower story about duty, fear, honor, humiliation, rescue, or necessity is running. The actor is not fake. The blindness is not fake. Both are true at the same time. That double truth is why tragedy remains morally useful. It prevents a sentimental view of goodness in which good intentions settle everything, and it prevents a cartoon view of evil in which wrong action always announces itself clearly in advance. A parent may be certain they are preparing a child for life when they are actually passing forward humiliation. A lover may believe they are protecting a bond while they are really strangling it with suspicion. A reformer may think they are serving justice while secretly feeding a need to punish. Tragedy does not remove answerability from any of these cases. It reminds us that self-interpretation is one of the places where fate can hide. It also explains why self-knowledge is not a luxury added to moral life after the important work is done. Without self-knowledge, sincerity is unstable. It can become one more instrument through which inherited blindness acts. That is the tragic warning modern people still need. It is not enough to care. It is not even enough to try hard. One must also ask what in oneself is using care and effort for purposes not yet confessed. Seen this way, Oedipus becomes less an ancient curiosity and more a structure that repeats whenever a person's deepest effort is entangled with what they least understand about themselves. Investigation can reveal guilt. It can also reveal that the self doing the investigating was never transparent to itself. That is the tragic lesson modern life keeps rediscovering in different costumes. Tragedy also corrects a modern fantasy about sincerity. We often assume that if an action was sincerely meant, its moral status is largely settled. Sophocles refuses that comfort. Sincerity can coexist with blindness. A person can be earnest and still terrible in effect. They can love and still suffocate. They can protect and still deform. They can seek justice and still import an old cruelty into the search. That is why tragedy belongs in any mature discussion of fate. It keeps us from confusing purity of intention with transparency of soul. This is also where institutions and families become newly legible. A household may call itself loving while training fear. A school may call itself excellent while breeding humiliation. A nation may call itself free while building whole classes of people into dependence. Tragic structures do not need choruses and oracles to exist. They require only patterned blindness, inherited role, and enough agency for people to move sincerely inside the pattern without seeing its full shape. Tragedy therefore rejects two shallow ideas at once. It rejects the fantasy that agency is absolute. It also rejects the fantasy that fate means laziness. Sometimes the terrible thing is precisely that one did act, did care, did search, did try to repair, and was still enclosed by conditions larger than sight. Once tragedy has made that visible, the mind is prepared for a more intimate question. If ignorance, family pattern, and social role can enter action so deeply, then desire itself may have a history as old and complicated as any prophecy. Few things feel more personal than desire. To want is to feel close to oneself. Hunger, love, ambition, disgust, relief, dread, curiosity, lust, aversion, these seem to rise from within as signatures of individuality. Yet the more carefully the mind looks, the less innocent wanting becomes. What a person is drawn toward, what they fear, what they call safety, what they mistake for love, what they think they deserve, what they cannot bear to lose, all of this has a past. That is why the distinction between freedom of action and freedom of will matters so much. Freedom of action asks, could I do what I wanted? Freedom of will asks, where did the wanting come from? The first question concerns obstacles and coercion. The second concerns authorship. Take a simple case. A person is free to leave a harmful relationship. The door is not locked. Friends have offered a couch. Money is tight but not absent. And yet the person stays. If freedom is defined only as the absence of chains, the case is straightforward. But lived experience resists that simplicity. The pull of familiarity, fear of loneliness, childhood training around appeasing conflict, the body's addiction to uncertainty followed by brief tenderness, shame at being seen as a failure, economic memory, religious training, all of this can enter the wanting. The door is unlocked, yet the will itself has been educated in captivity. This is not therapy language. It is a philosophical point about sourcehood. A desire may express a person and still not be deeply self-authored. It may feel like me because it has been rehearsed so long that it became difficult to distinguish from identity. The same structure appears in less dramatic forms. Why does one person experience rest as guilt? Why does another experience praise as danger? Why does one sibling find comfort in order and another feel suffocated by it? Why does one worker hear opportunity and think expansion, while another hears the same word and thinks entrapment? The will is not born in clean air. It is shaped by memory, body, social meaning, reward, punishment, and stories repeatedly told about what sort of person one is. Once this is seen, many arguments about choice acquire a new edge. No one forced you remains true in many situations, but it no longer reaches the center of the matter. The center is that the chooser may have been formed to want in a very particular way. Freedom of action survives this observation more easily than freedom of will. It is worth noticing how often moral conversation avoids this distinction because it is inconvenient. Institutions like clear responsibility, families like tidy stories about who overreacted. Individuals prefer a language that either condemns or absolves quickly. To ask where wanting came from complicates all of that. It forces the room to admit that motives are partly autobiographical records. Desire is never just present tense. The complication is not only sympathetic, it can be accusatory too. If someone repeatedly chooses admiration over honesty or control over tenderness, the historical nature of desire may reveal how deep the pattern has become. The will then appears less innocent than before, not because it is free of causes, but because it has been giving itself to certain causes for so long that they have started to feel natural. Social life reinforces this more than people like to admit. Desire is schooled by what receives applause. If a child is praised mainly for being useful, they may grow into an adult who experiences need as value and rest as danger. If beauty is treated as the price of belonging, longing can begin to organize itself around being seen rather than being known. If success is praised without mercy, ambition may begin to feel like the only respectable form of aliveness. In each case, the wanting is real. It is also educated. Culture enters the will one reward at a time. This is one reason nighttime reflection often turns cruel. The mind sees not only the act, but the old pattern within the act. It recognizes that this was not the first time fear dressed itself as prudence, not the first time approval was accepted as love, not the first time anger defended a wound more than a principle. The decision begins to look like a paragraph in a biography that had been drafted long before the event. There is also a quieter problem. Some desires are not dramatic enough to alarm us, so they go unexamined for years. The wish always to seem composed, the wish never to owe anyone gratitude, the wish to be admired for understanding rather than forced to depend on another person's patience. These motives can guide whole lives while looking like personality. Then one day a relationship fails, or work becomes unbearable, or loneliness hardens, and the person discovers that what felt natural was also historical. The will had been carrying old bargains under the name of identity. Still, history is not the same as finality. To say wanting has a history is not to say wanting is fake, it is to say wanting is situated. A person does not choose from nowhere, and the will does not descend fresh each morning. That makes the question of authorship harder, but also more truthful. One useful test is to notice which motives become sacred the moment they are questioned. A person says, "That is simply who I am," and the phrase may mean honesty, but it may also mean surrender. It may mark the point where repetition has hardened into identity. The one who says they are not made for rest, or not made for tenderness, or not made for uncertainty, may be describing temperament. They may also be announcing that old training has become a law inside them. Once desire reaches that point, criticism feels like an attack on existence itself. That is why origins of wanting provoke so much anger. They challenge not only one act, but the authority of the story by which the self explains its own inevitabilities. There is a temptation here to demand total self-creation. If desires were shaped before examination, perhaps nothing about them is mine. But total self-creation is an impossible standard even before determinism enters the room. No one authors the starting materials. No one designs the first body's sensitivities, the original family language, or the initial field of reward and fear. The deeper question is not whether desire was influenced. Of course it was. The deeper question is how much ownership is possible within influence. That is the point where modern arguments about determinism begin to matter. Once wanting itself has a history, causes no longer seem like remote abstractions belonging to physics classes. They become intimate. They are in appetite, recoil, habit, loyalty, shame, and self-interpretation. The chain is not somewhere outside life. It is inside the will. Many people can live for years without thinking about determinism, until one specific mood calls it forth. It often happens at the edge of fatigue, when the mind has stopped performing competence. Suddenly, even resistance begins to look caused. The objection one is preparing to make seems itself prepared by prior conditions. A memory surfaces, and with it comes a thought both simple and unsettling. If every thought arrives from somewhere, how much of this stream counts as mine? Causal determinism, in the philosophical sense, is a thesis about order. Given the state of the world at one time and the laws of nature, the state of the world at a later time is fixed. However technical that may sound, its sting is felt in a very human way. If the past and the laws are not up to me, then in what sense are the results up to me? This pressure is often presented through the consequence argument. In plain language, it says something like this: if determinism is true, then present acts are consequences of the distant past together with the laws of nature. I do not control the distant past. I do not control the laws of nature. So it seems, I do not control the consequences. There is a stark force to that reasoning. It does not need mystical rhetoric to disturb, yet even here the mind can go wrong in two opposite directions. One mistake is to hear determinism and convert it into teleology, as if the universe intended what happened. The other is to hear determinism and treat effort as fake. Both responses move too quickly. A caused event is not necessarily a meaningful message, and a caused effort is not therefore useless. A person studies because earlier causes made study possible and attractive. Then the studying itself becomes part of what causes later success. A person apologizes because remorse, relationship, and moral training converge. Then the apology changes what happens next. The causal story is not a spectator story. It includes trying. This is why determinism, if true, would be more haunting than fatalism in one way, and less suffocating in another. More haunting, because it does not let us dismiss ourselves as irrelevant. Our decisions matter, but they matter as causes within a network we did not create. Less suffocating, because it does not say nothing we do makes a difference. It says difference itself is causally structured. Still, the authorship wound remains. If a decision to apologize arose from prior character, upbringing, current mood, and the whole state of the world, then even the best action may not feel self-originating. A great deal may depend on it, and yet it may not feel ultimately mine. That is the raw point from which incompatibilist fear draws much of its power. There is another quiet feature of determinist thinking worth noticing. It can change how regret feels. Regret usually imagines a fork where the person could simply have stepped the other way. A strongly causal picture complicates that imagination. It asks what would have had to be different for the other action to occur. More knowledge, another habit, less fear, a different childhood, better sleep, a gentler social world. Once those questions enter, regret becomes less theatrical. It may become sadder, but also more exact. That exactness can be morally cleansing even when it is not comforting. Instead of repeating, "I should have been different," the mind begins asking how difference actually becomes possible. What conversation was never had? What pattern was never interrupted? What bodily condition made patience unavailable that day? What humiliation was being defended? Determinism does not answer all of those questions, but it makes them harder to avoid. It turns remorse away from fantasy and back toward formation. Determinism cannot honestly provide immediate consolation. To say that everything has causes does not remove injury. It does not tell a betrayed person that betrayal was acceptable. It does not tell a cruel person that cruelty was innocent. It only alters the framework in which judgment occurs. Nor should determinism be confused with coldness. Some of the people most drawn to deterministic thinking are not trying to reduce life to machinery because they hate feeling. They are trying to understand feeling well enough not to mythologize it. If terror rises from a body shaped by earlier events, that does not make terror less intense. If tenderness grows out of memory and trust, that does not make tenderness less beautiful. Causation does not bleach experience, it situates it. This is why the deterministic picture can humble vanity as much as it threatens pride. Success begins to look less self-originated than many people want to admit. Talent becomes historically embedded. Weakness does too. One person's ease, another person's chronic alarm, the timing of mentorship, the luck of health, the accidents of public approval, all begin to enter what had once been narrated as private merit alone. That recognition can wound the ego. It can also make the ego less cruel. It can also make gratitude more intelligent. Gratitude stops being a vague feeling of being blessed and becomes a clearer recognition of support. A patient teacher mattered, a safer neighborhood mattered, medicine mattered, a friend's interruption mattered, luck in timing mattered. Once those things are allowed back into the picture, dignity no longer has to depend on pretending one rose by untouched will alone. The self becomes less isolated in both pride and shame. Determinism, therefore, does something socially useful even before one settles whether it is true. It forces the memory of luck back into moral conversation. The person praised for discipline may have inherited stable routines, decent health, and a world arranged to reward their strengths. The person condemned for chaos may have inherited the opposite. Effort remains real, but effort no longer floats above conditions as though conditions were decorative. This does not answer the metaphysical question. It makes the human stakes of the question impossible to sanitize. It also changes how one listens to other people's explanations without becoming naive. When someone says, "I do not know why I keep doing this," the deterministic ear does not hear nonsense. It hears that the person is dimly aware of causes active in them that they have not yet learned to name. Shame, panic, class memory, bodily dependence, craving for approval, dread of abandonment, reflexive anger. All of these can become operative before a clean self-description arrives. That does not make the action less consequential. It makes understanding more demanding. If human beings are caused all the way down, then moral seriousness has to include the patient labor of learning which causes are repeatedly being obeyed in the dark. And that framework matters because moral life depends on distinctions. We already treat coercion differently from carelessness, compulsion differently from malice, ignorance differently from contempt. Compatibilism begins from the sense that these differences remain meaningful even in a caused world. The question is whether they remain meaningful enough. A great many philosophical arguments begin from a familiar difference. There is a moral gap between a hand moved by force and a hand moved by a person's own reasons. If someone grips your wrist and uses it to strike another person, the act is not yours in the same way it would be if you chose it. If a threat removes all realistic alternative, responsibility changes. If a seizure overtakes the body, evaluation changes again. Ordinary life is full of such distinctions. Compatibilism takes them seriously. The compatibilist claim, in broad form, is that meaningful freedom can survive determinism. Freedom may not require standing outside causation. It may require something more modest and more practical. The ability to act from one's own reasons, character, and evaluative capacities without external compulsion. On this view, causedness is not the enemy. The real enemy is the wrong kind of cause, the kind that bypasses or distorts the agent's ordinary capacities. That insight has real moral power. It protects the difference between coercion and consent, between panic and deliberation, between a compulsive act and a considered act. A world in which all caused behavior were treated as one flat category would be almost impossible to inhabit. Law, friendship, education, apology, trust, and self-respect all rely on finer discriminations than that. Some compatibilists emphasize alternatives less than responsiveness. A free person in this register is not a magical starter of action. A free person is someone whose conduct can answer to reasons. They can hear a consideration against what they are doing and be moved by it under the right conditions. They can recognize evidence, revise intention, restrain impulse, honor a promise, accept correction. None of this requires being uncaused. It requires the right relationship between reflection and action. There is something deeply plausible here. Consider the difference between two drivers heading home after drinking. One is physically dragged into the car and made to drive at gunpoint. The other has the keys, hears friends object, feels the warning in their own body, and still decides to drive. Both acts have causes, yet only someone determined to flatten moral reality would say the causes make them the same kind of act. The second driver is reasons addressable in a way the first is not. Compatibilism also guards against a childish picture of freedom. Many people imagine freedom as if it meant popping out of the causal order entirely, like a ghost issuing commands to a body from nowhere. But action detached from every influence would be unintelligible. Reasons influence us, memory influences us, character influences us, love influences us. Moral education influences us. The question is not whether influence exists. The question is whether the person remains present in the way influence becomes action. Even so, compatibilism can feel emotionally incomplete. To say that I acted from my own reasons and character may settle questions about coercion, but it does not settle where those reasons and character came from. Perhaps the act went through me. Did it originate in me deeply enough? That objection does not disappear because compatibilism is practical. It sharpens precisely because compatibilism is practical and therefore close to real life. Still, its practical strength should not be dismissed too quickly. In actual relationships, what people often need to know is not whether a choice was uncaused in some ultimate sense. They need to know whether the person could hear a warning, could understand harm, could pause, could respond to reasons, could refrain, could learn. That is why trust is built around patterns of responsiveness rather than around metaphysical purity. A trustworthy person is not a self-created God. They are someone whose reasons, promises, and attention can still be reached. Still, before turning to that objection, it is worth lingering over compatibilism's achievement. It refuses false extremes. It does not demand a miracle in order to preserve agency. It says a person can be meaningfully free in the sense relevant to many parts of moral life, without being metaphysically self-created. That may not satisfy every hunger, but it protects a middle terrain people already rely on whenever they distinguish persuasion from force, habit from compulsion, and reflection from panic. That protection matters outside seminars. Courts rely on it, friendships rely on it, parenting relies on it, education relies on it. The whole practice of giving reasons to one another assumes that people can be shaped by argument without being reduced to puppets. If that assumption were false in every sense, praise and blame would become oddly theatrical. Compatibilism therefore preserves something ancient and ordinary. The thought that human beings are not exempt from causation and are still the sorts of beings to whom appeal, criticism, promise, warning, and trust can be directed. Even if one finds the theory incomplete, it identifies a real feature of experience. The everyday proof of that feature is simple. People do change course after conversation. They hear a friend describe hurt more plainly than before, and something in them stops resisting. They learn that the story they were telling about necessity was partly convenience. They discover that an old habit does not survive close scrutiny as easily as it survives speed. None of that proves ultimate self-authorship. It does show why reasons remain part of moral life. We speak to one another because human conduct is not merely pushed from the outside. It is also shaped by what can be understood, admitted, and answered. It also has the virtue of noticing uneven freedom in actual lives. One person grows up among adults who model apology and verbal clarity. Another grows up where every mistake is answered with mockery or threat. Later, both are told simply to exercise their agency. In one sense, that demand is reasonable. In another, it hides the fact that the very capacities by which agency operates have not been distributed equally. Compatibilism is strongest when it can speak about capacities, responsiveness, and impediments with enough precision to acknowledge that difference without abandoning responsibility. This is one reason compatibilism often sounds morally saner than grander theories, even to people who remain dissatisfied with it. It has room for diminished capacity without dissolving all conduct into sameness. It can say that addiction, panic, coercive control, trauma, and manipulation matter to freedom because they change how reasons are received and acted on. That is already a major truth. A philosophy that cannot honor that truth will speak badly about law, friendship, healing, and education, no matter how impressive its abstractions become. The trouble is that middle terrain may still leave a deeper wound untouched. What if the very character that makes an action mine is exactly what I never made? That is the deeper wound sourcehood theories keep returning us to. Imagine someone says, "At least the decision came from me." At first, this sounds decisive. After all, what more could ownership mean than that the act expressed one's own character, motives, and judgment? But for many people, this answer does not heal the problem. It intensifies it. If the decision came from me, and the me it came from was itself shaped by causes I never chose, then saying the act came from me simply pushes the question back one level. This is the sourcehood worry. It asks not only whether an action issued from the agent, but whether the agent is the right sort of source. Ultimate self-authorship is the fantasy at the edge of this worry. If only I had made myself, then my actions would be truly mine. But no one makes the materials from which they begin. No one drafts the first personality, first bodily tendency, first social rank, first grief, first fear, first language of approval and shame. Because of that, sourcehood arguments can sound impossible and still feel compelling. Impossible, because total self-creation makes no sense for a finite creature. Compelling, because merely tracing action through present character seems too weak when present character is itself historical. Manipulation cases reveal the issue sharply. If a person's desires were artificially implanted or systematically distorted, we hesitate to call their later actions fully free, even when those actions express what they now want. Why? Because expression is not enough when the springs of the will have been arranged from elsewhere in the wrong way. The example is dramatic, but it clarifies ordinary life as well. People are not laboratory puppets, yet schooling, propaganda, abuse, ideology, addiction, and repeated social reward can all tilt the will without announcing themselves as manipulation. Here the fear of fate becomes very personal again. It is one thing to say the universe follows laws. It is another to wonder whether one's loves, angers, ambitions, and loyalties were formed under pressures one did not understand well enough to resist. The self may then feel both intimate and inherited, mine because no one else has to live from inside it, given because so much of it was assembled before critique. There are two bad reactions to this thought. One is melodrama, because I did not create myself absolutely, nothing about me counts as mine. The other is denial, because complete self-creation is impossible. The whole problem is silly. Better to admit the dignity of the wound. Human beings want not only to act, but to be able to stand behind their action without feeling borrowed. That desire is not childish. It is bound up with dignity. One can feel that dignity most sharply when someone tries to strip it away. Manipulative relationships often work by telling a person what they want before the person has learned how to ask. Whole ideologies can do the same at scale. They can teach people which fears are respectable, which hopes are shameful, which desires count as adult, which dependencies should never be named. Later, when the person acts from those installed valuations, the action still feels intimate because it is lived from within. Sourcehood questions stay alive because people know often in a painful, half-conscious way, that intimacy alone does not prove freedom. The desire can even be heard in ordinary apologies. When someone says, "That was not who I want to be," they are not usually denying that the act was theirs. They are protesting that the act revealed a source they do not fully endorse. The sentence carries both ownership and distance. It says, "This came from me, and yet I do not consent to becoming identical with the pattern that produced it." That fragile difference is morally important. It is part of why people labor to change. That difference can be morally healthy even when it is painful. Without it, people tend to collapse into one of two errors. They either identify so completely with the act that change feels impossible, or they distance themselves so completely that no real confession happens. Sourcehood reflection, at its best, protects a middle sentence. This was mine, and I do not want to keep becoming the kind of source from which such things emerge. That sentence contains grief, responsibility, and hope at once. It is one of the few honest ways finite creatures can speak when they are trying to answer for conduct they did not spring from nowhere and yet cannot simply blame on fate. Sourcehood problems also make self-knowledge emotionally expensive. To examine the origins of one's motives is not a neutral task. It can expose how much of what felt noble was mixed with vanity, how much of what felt loyal was fear of abandonment, how much of what felt principled was resentment wearing formal clothes. No wonder people often protect themselves from the question by insisting either on total innocence or total helplessness. The difficulty is that dignity may have to live without ultimacy. A person can be a real source in one sense, and not an ultimate source in another. They can answer for an action, revise their habits, recognize a motive, refuse an impulse, and still not have invented the raw character from which those powers emerged. This mixed condition may be unsatisfying, but it is recognizably human. Perhaps that is why serious change so often begins with an oddly modest kind of truthfulness. Not, "I have discovered my eternal essence," and not, "None of this is really me," but "This pattern is active in me, and I do not want to keep serving it." That sentence has no metaphysical grandeur. It is still one of the most important sentences a person can learn to say. It refuses the vanity of purity and the laziness of surrender at the same time. Sourcehood, in a finite life, may consist less in having created oneself than in becoming increasingly unwilling to hide from what one has become. Even limited authorship matters because refusal can still alter what grows. There is also a social temptation hidden in sourcehood language. Sometimes people demand impossible purity from others because it saves them from examining the conditions that helped produce what they condemn. If a wrongdoer must be imagined as a fully self-originating source of evil, then institutions, families, and cultural rewards can breathe easier. They no longer have to ask how they prepared the ground. That does not remove individual answerability. It shows why total self-authorship remains such an attractive fantasy. It protects both pride and punishment, yet the opposite mistake is waiting nearby. Faux Käsendwani Pontigo. If one becomes so fascinated by conditions that no stable language of answerability survives, then sourcehood dissolves into anthropology. The person becomes only an example of forces. That picture may feel intelligent for a moment. It becomes morally thin very quickly. Human beings do not only display causes, they also hear questions, make promises, break promises, revise, conceal, and confess. The whole point of keeping sourcehood alive, even in a limited form, is to preserve the reality that a person can still be addressed. They can be called back to what they did. They can be asked whether they are willing to keep becoming this. Compatibilism can live with mixture more easily than some listeners can. It may say, enough sourcehood exists if the action came through the agent's own evaluative capacities under the right conditions. Yet the night mind often presses further. Who authored those capacities? That question does not disappear by force. It has to be met honestly. Once it is met honestly, another hope often appears. Perhaps what freedom needs is not compatibility with causes, but a break in the chain. Perhaps indeterminacy could rescue ownership where determinism threatens it. But that hope has troubles of its own. Suppose someone says, "If everything were determined, I could not be free, so freedom must require some undetermined element, some point where the choice is not fixed by the past." The wish behind this thought is easy to understand. It wants a door out of inherited necessity. It wants room in which agency can breathe. But now imagine a choice happening by inner dice roll. Imagine all the reasons, habits, and memories are present, and then at the critical instant some undetermined factor tips the act one way rather than another. Would that feel more like ownership, or would it feel like luck? This is the force of the argument from luck that troubles many incompatibilist theories. If indeterminism enters at the wrong place, it does not create control, it weakens it. A random twitch added to deliberation does not become freedom just because it is uncaused by prior conditions. If anything, it makes the choice less attributable to the person. Of course, more sophisticated defenders of libertarian freedom do not describe agency as roulette in the soul. They try to explain how an undetermined decision could still be guided by reasons and owned by the agent. The point here is not to caricature them. The point is simpler. Escaping determinism does not automatically solve the authorship problem. A choice that is partly random may feel less like mine, not more. This is one of the saddest and most clarifying turns in the whole debate. The mind often assumes there are only two options. Either actions are caused, in which case freedom seems threatened, or they are uncaused, in which case freedom is saved. But once randomness is inspected, the second option stops looking like salvation. A will ungoverned by causes would not obviously be a will one could respect. That is why more serious libertarian positions try to place indeterminacy inside deliberation rather than in place of it. They want the agent to be actively weighing reasons, not flipping a coin in the dark. That effort deserves fairness. Yet even with the strongest version, the difficulty remains plain enough to trouble the mind. If two live possibilities are genuinely open all the way down, what explains why one becomes actual without making the outcome look partly lucky? The theory becomes more subtle than roulette, but the ache does not disappear. In everyday life, we already understand this. If a loved one excuses betrayal by saying, "I just don't know what came over me," the sentence does not restore trust, it weakens it. What we want from one another is not randomness but intelligibility. We want actions to be connected to reasons, promises, and recognizable character. The more a choice seems like an eruption with no relation to any accountable structure, the less free and more alarming it appears. The same is true in self-judgment. People rarely feel proud of acts that seem to happen in a blur cut loose from their own commitments. They feel frightened by them. They look back and ask what kind of fracture, intoxication, panic, or confusion was present. Freedom, in lived moral language, has always meant more than unpredictability. It means that a person's reasons can be seen in what they do, even when those reasons are flawed, so even the fantasy of spontaneous purity hides an odd contradiction. We ask freedom to rescue responsibility, but the kind of event that would most clearly escape prior determination might also be the kind of event least attributable to a person. That does not end the debate, but it does force a more serious question. Perhaps what we value in freedom is not metaphysical independence alone, but dependable answerability. That does not force us into determinism, nor does it prove compatibilism. It only blocks an easy fantasy. There may be no pure metaphysical shelter waiting at the end of the argument. No single doctrine may remove every discomfort. It also changes how we hear praise. If blame cannot simply be a verdict on a self-made soul, praise cannot be either. Admiration becomes more intelligent when it notices formation, support, and inherited luck, without reducing achievement to luck alone. A generous action may still deserve gratitude, even if the capacity for generosity has a history. A disciplined life may still deserve respect, even if discipline was not summoned from nowhere. Thinking this way keeps moral life from collapsing into either flattery or cynicism. This realization can be frustrating. Philosophy sometimes seems cruel in this way. It removes false exits before it offers any livable path. But false exits are a real danger here. If one thinks randomness rescues freedom, one may end up defending a version of selfhood that no longer explains responsibility or deliberation at all. There is still something valuable in going through that disappointment. It purifies the wish. At first, many people want freedom because they want to feel untouchable by the past. Later, if thought becomes more honest, they may want something humbler and more real. Not exemption from all conditions, but enough lucidity to answer for what they do, repair what they can, and participate in formation without pretending to be self-created. Losing the fantasy of randomness can help that humbler desire come into view. That humbler desire may also be closer to what many people were really after from the beginning. Most human beings do not spend sleepless hours longing to become metaphysical miracles. They want to know whether their effort can matter, whether they can become less dangerous to those they love, whether one old pattern has to keep dictating the next scene. The language of indeterminacy can sound like it answers those fears, but only if it is left vague. Once examined, the better hope is not mystery inside the will. It is that reflection, practice, conversation and repair remain real parts of the causal order rather than decorations added to it. Seen from that angle, the argument from luck performs an unexpected kindness. It closes one impressive-sounding escape route so that a less glamorous path can be taken seriously. The less glamorous path says that moral life is built through intelligible action, reasons heard, habits interrupted, truth told, environments altered, promises kept, and harms repaired. None of that feels as dramatic as a will breaking free of the universe. It feels more like what actual lives are made of. And because actual lives are what hurt, that smaller path may be the one that matters. So where does that leave moral life? If strict determinism seems to threaten deep authorship, and indeterminism does not restore it, then perhaps blame and responsibility have to be described in a less absolute register. That shift can sound like surrender at first. In fact, it may be one of the few ways to keep seriousness without metaphysical arrogance. There is a difference between explaining a harm and excusing it. Many people resist any causal account of human action because they hear explanation as betrayal. If cruelty has causes, does cruelty become permissible? If betrayal emerged from fear, weakness, learned selfishness, and history, does the wound shrink? Obviously not. Harm remains harm. A broken promise stays broken. A violent act does not become gentle because one can narrate how the person became capable of it. Yet moral life becomes unbearable if blame is our only category. Philosophers skeptical about ultimate moral responsibility often focus on basic desert. The idea that people deserve praise or blame simply because of what they have done, independent of forward-looking reasons such as protection, repair, or formation. Once the self is seen as historically shaped, this notion becomes difficult to defend with full confidence. That does not mean nothing remains. Responsibility can survive in other forms. A person can be answerable for what they did. They can owe an explanation. They can owe repair. They can need to be restrained for the safety of others. Communities can still require truth, restitution, distance, protection, apology, and change. Future formation still matters. Character still matters. This distinction is crucial because it changes the tone of judgment without making judgment disappear. Instead of asking only, how much punishment is metaphysically deserved, one begins to ask, what truth is owed, what repair is possible, what limits are necessary, what pattern must be interrupted, what conditions helped produce this, and how can those conditions be changed? These are not softer questions. Often they are harder because they require patience rather than righteous heat. There is also mercy in this turn, though not the easy kind. When the causes of action are seen more clearly, cruelty and blame can loosen. One may still condemn the act, cut off access, refuse reconciliation, or demand accountability, but the person no longer appears as a monster who sprang from nowhere to stain an otherwise clean moral world. They appear as a human being in whom certain terrible causes matured into conduct. That does not remove fear. It can remove some hatred. This is especially important wherever injury repeats across generations. Families often inherit not only pain but style, how anger is expressed, how silence is used, what counts as weakness, what must never be admitted, when tenderness is mocked, when apology is delayed. If blame remains purely desert-based, every generation encounters the next, as though it had appeared without history. But once history enters the frame, interruption becomes as important as accusation. Political and institutional life carries the same lesson. A social order can produce predictable harms through housing, schooling, punishment, labor, and public contempt. Then individualize every failure as though it had no background. Causal clarity does not erase agency inside such systems. It forbids the laziness of pretending the system played no role. The same is true inwardly. A person reviewing their own failures may find that causal understanding weakens a certain form of self-loathing, not by saying that nothing counts, but by seeing the act in context. Shame becomes more intelligent when it stops pretending the self was created in a vacuum. One can grieve what happened, accept answerability, and still refuse the fantasy that pure condemnation tells the full truth. This is why responsibility under constraint may be less about metaphysical vengeance and more about practices. Giving reasons, hearing reasons, repairing damage, protecting others, building institutions that reduce predictable harms, training attention, forming habits, refusing the lie that pain justifies repetition. These are ways of treating people as morally significant without pretending they are gods. Repair deserves emphasis because it is where philosophy has to touch the ground. If someone lies, the first serious question is not whether they deserve eternal condemnation. It is whether the truth can now be told, whether damage can be acknowledged, whether trust can be rebuilt or must be relinquished, whether the pattern that led here is still being protected. A causal understanding of action does not make repair optional. It often makes repair more central, because it directs attention toward what actually changes futures, rather than toward the emotional heat of judgment alone. There is a risk here too. Some people hear causal explanation and slide into softness that abandons the vulnerable. That would be another mistake. Protection matters. Boundaries matter. Not every wrongdoer is safe to keep close simply because their history is sad or legible. Moral seriousness without hatred still knows how to say no. There is also quiet political wisdom in moving away from desert. Societies addicted to condemnation often treat punishment as the whole content of justice. But if responsibility includes repair and future formation, then patience, design, and prevention become morally serious too. It starts to matter whether schools train humiliation or confidence, whether neighborhoods train hypervigilance or trust, whether work trains deception or candor. The point is not to dissolve the individual into the system. The point is to recognize that systems become part of the material from which individuals later act. Even private life begins to look different under this light. A household can ask not only who was wrong, but what arrangement keeps producing the same wrong. Which fears are never spoken until they explode? Which child is carrying the family's shame? Which kind of truth gets punished so quickly that secrecy begins to look intelligent? Moving blame in this direction does not weaken moral life. It makes moral life more diagnostic. It becomes less interested in theatrical purity and more interested in whether the pattern will keep making the same wound. This is one reason the most merciful forms of accountability often feel harder, not softer. It is easier to denounce someone and leave the machinery untouched than to ask what relationships, institutions, daily permissions, and repeated silences kept preparing the same harm. A serious community still draws lines. It still protects the vulnerable. It may still punish, but it also knows that if the causes remain in place, moral outrage will only prepare another performance of the same failure with different names attached to it. The same principle holds inside a single person. If I keep injuring others in the same way, self-reproach by itself may only become another ritual that leaves the machinery intact. The better question is harsher and kinder together. What am I protecting each time I do this? What fear is being obeyed? What pleasure is being defended? What story about myself grows stronger when I repeat the act? Accountability becomes deeper at that point because it no longer settles for emotional display. It begins asking what would actually stop the wound from being handed forward again. Once blame changes in this way, the question of agency changes again. If ultimate desert is less secure than we hoped, then perhaps what matters most is not standing outside causes, but learning how to participate in the causes that shape future action. That turns our attention toward habit. Much of life is built in ways that barely feel like building while they are happening. A person reaches for a drink after work each evening and calls it routine. Another avoids difficult conversations and calls it keeping the peace. Another gets up early to walk even when the weather is dull and barely thinks of it as philosophy at all. Years later, these repetitions appear under a different name: temperament, coping style, marriage pattern, discipline, dependency, character. This is why habit belongs in any honest conversation about fate. If character shapes choice and repeated choices help shape character, then the person is neither a pure origin nor a pure puppet. Earlier actions become later conditions. What was once a small act can become the atmosphere inside which larger acts occur. Ancient philosophy knew this well, even when the exact frameworks differ. Human beings are creatures in whom repetition sinks downward. The first lie may feel sharp and visible. The 10th lies under the tongue more easily. The first act of courage trembles. The later act may come with less theatre, because a path has been worn. This does not solve the regress. A person did not choose the original conditions from which habits began. One child's environment teaches steadiness. Another's teaches hypervigilance. One person inherits room for experiment. Another inherits punishment for visible error. So habit can never become a self-help fable in which anyone can manufacture any self by sheer determination. Still, bounded is not the same as powerless. One of the few forms of authorship available to finite creatures is participatory rather than original. We can enter the stream of causes and through repetition alter what sort of person will meet the next decision. Sometimes this is dramatic. More often it is humble. Leaving the phone in another room, telling one honest sentence sooner than usual, going to bed rather than inviting another hour of agitation, refusing one ritual of resentment, keeping one appointment with thought. This is why habits should be understood not only as actions repeated, but as expectations installed. The person who postpones hard conversations teaches themselves that dread must always be obeyed first. The person who tells one small truth early teaches themselves that conflict can be survived before it turns into catastrophe. The person who reaches for numbness every evening teaches the body that discomfort is an emergency. The person who sits with discomfort for 10 more minutes teaches the body something else. Repetition is education, whether we intend it to be or not. Habit also introduces humility because it shifts attention from heroic willpower to conditions. If a person knows that late-night fatigue leads reliably to self-sabotage, then arranging an environment that narrows that path is not cheating, it is wisdom about causation. If one knows that shame drives secrecy, then building relationships where confession is survivable becomes part of moral practice. This is one place where ancient moral seriousness meets ordinary housekeeping. Where is the bottle kept? When is the phone charged? Which friend is called first? Whether the apology is drafted before self-justification has time to rehearse. Whether sleep is protected before resentment is fed. These details may look too small for philosophy until one notices that large failures are often carried into being by small permissions granted again and again. Fate in modern life often arrives through routine rather than omen. This approach is less glamorous than freedom as miracle. It is also more believable. The self need not be the absolute author of itself in order to take part in what it becomes next. A musician practices scales not because the hand is uncaused, but because repeated cause can become graceful capacity. A patient person may once have been impatient and learned to insert time between spark and response. A sober life may begin not in one titanic choice, but in dozens of small rearrangements. One reason this matters for the fear of fate is that habits are how causes acquire intimacy. A person may reject talk of destiny and still wake each day inside patterns that behave like local necessities. Morning resentment, evening numbness, the reflex to conceal embarrassment by attacking first, the practice of postponing what matters until urgency becomes excuse. These habits can bind more effectively than myth. But that same closeness is what makes habit one of the few places where alteration can be earned. Not complete reinvention, earned alteration. Enough repeated contrary action, enough rearranged conditions, enough honest interruption, and the next moment is met by a somewhat different person than before. The thread was not rewoven from nothing, it was guided differently at a point that mattered. Habit can also be understood as accumulation of permission. The first time a person lies, there is often an inward resistance. The second lie finds less resistance because the first already taught the body that survival was possible afterward. The same is true in better directions. The first honest admission may feel humiliating. The second carries the memory of having survived truth once before. Habits therefore shape not only action but what kind of future the self believes it can endure. The future is written forward in a peculiar sense, not because destiny whispers a private script, but because repetition inscribes tendencies into body and mind. The question of agency shifts from "did I invent myself?" to "how am I participating in what I am becoming?" That question is morally useful because it is honest about scale. Most people do not wake up and rewrite their entire character in one night. They do, however, keep voting for certain futures. They vote when they rehearse an injury instead of naming it. They vote when they let embarrassment become attack. They vote when they tell the difficult truth before the old disguise gathers itself. A habit is a ballot cast repeatedly in favor of one future self rather than another. This can sound severe until one notices that it works in merciful directions too. A person who has always fled hard conversations may not become brave all at once, but one cleaner sentence changes what the body expects from honesty. Someone who has always confused exhaustion with personal failure may learn by repeated rest that gentleness does not destroy duty. A parent who inherited ridicule may interrupt it once, then again, and slowly cease to feel ridicule as natural speech. Habits are powerful not because they create miracles, but because they can make a once unthinkable response more available next time. There is a danger in speaking this way if life begins to sound managerial, as though existence were only a matter of optimization. That is not the point. The point is moral architecture. A person under constraint can still help shape the architecture under which the next moment of constraint will be met. And inside that architecture, one quiet practice keeps returning: attention. Events often end before our interpretations do. A conversation is over by 6 in the evening, but at midnight the mind is still adding lines to it. A face is remembered, a tone is replayed, an omission is enlarged, a private accusation is drafted and redrafted. This is one of the most ordinary places where agency under constraint appears. The event may already be fixed, the return to it is not yet finished. Stoic thought helps here again, not by denying reality, but by distinguishing appearance from endorsement. An impression says, "This humiliation proves your worth." Another says, "Because you failed once, the pattern is your essence." Another says, "The loss was pointless, so grief must remain meaningless." None of these interpretations arrives wearing a label that says interpretation. They arrive as if they were the thing itself. Attention is the faculty by which the mind keeps giving life to one reading rather than another. Where attention repeatedly goes, interpretation thickens. This is why attention matters morally, not because a person can choose every passing thought, but because repeated return builds the world in which later judgment occurs. A person who keeps rehearsing injury may become more available to vengeance. A person who keeps rehearsing contempt may become unable to hear correction. A person who keeps rehearsing their own defect may turn one mistake into a total identity. In each case, the original event matters, but so does the ongoing act of mental attendance. None of this licenses fantasy. Interpretation is not the power to declare pain good, abuse educational, betrayal spiritually necessary, or loss secretly deserved. The work of interpretation is more modest and more difficult. It asks what an event truly means, not what would comfort us most quickly. Sometimes the truest interpretation remains, "This was wrong." Sometimes it becomes, "This harmed me, but it need not become my whole explanation." Sometimes it becomes, "The fear was real, but the conclusion I drew from the fear was false." Asking for reasons belongs here too. One mark of agency is the ability to bring conduct into the space where it can be questioned. Why did I say that? What was I defending? What picture of the other person was I protecting? Why did this temptation look like relief? Reason giving does not require a person to be an uncaused source. It requires that motives can become examinable rather than sacred. That is why answerability matters. To be answerable is not merely to be punishable, it is to be the kind of being who can be asked for an account. Not a perfect account, not an account free from self-deception, but an account that matters. We expect reasons from one another because we sense that even in a caused world, human beings are sites of reflection, not merely impact points. Attention therefore functions as a door, though often a narrow one. It does not swing wide on command. Exhaustion narrows it, depression narrows it, fear narrows it. Social coercion can narrow it almost to nothing. But when it opens at all, even slightly, it allows a different relation to the chain. One can notice a thought without marrying it instantly. One can withhold endorsement from a humiliation story. One can return to an event without feeding its most destructive interpretation. There is training in this, even if the training is modest. A person can learn to notice the first bodily signs that an old interpretation is about to seize the scene. The jaw locks, the stomach drops, the mind begins to draft a familiar sentence. "No one respects me, I always ruin this, I need to strike first, I have already lost." Catching the sentence at that early stage does not guarantee freedom, but it creates a little more room than was there before. Attention is often nothing more glamorous than this early noticing practiced enough times that inevitability begins to crack. This kind of attention is often easier to describe than to practice because modern life rewards fragmentation. Outrage markets itself as seriousness. Endless distraction masquerades as relief. The mind can become so trained in interruption that it rarely sees its own interpretations long enough to test them. In that setting, attention is not a luxury. It is one of the last conditions under which reasons can still be heard over reflex. For that reason, attention is bound up with environment more deeply than many people like to admit. Certain rooms make reflection harder. Certain media diets make every irritation sound apocalyptic. Certain friendships keep translating grief into grievance because grievance is easier to share. A person who notices this is not being precious when they guard quiet, choose slower company, or step back from a stream of constant agitation. They are protecting one of the few conditions under which judgment can remain more than a reflexive echo of whatever has shouted loudest all day. Attention also has a communal side that is easy to miss. Other people help hold open or shut the door of reflection. One friend turns every discomfort into revenge and narrows thought. Another asks one honest question and prevents a whole night of bad interpretation from hardening into certainty. A good teacher, lover, sibling, or witness can sometimes lend a person enough steadiness to examine an impulse rather than obey it. Agency is often scaffolded. We learn how to attend through voices we have heard and rooms we have lived in. And reasons matter because they create a space where cause and conversation meet. A person changes their action after hearing a friend's objection. A worker declines a cruel order after noticing the humanity of the person it would hurt. A parent stops mid-sentence because the child in front of them suddenly matters more than the old script rising in the throat. None of this stands outside causation. It shows causation becoming reflective, social, and revisable through attention. This is also why solitary strength is not the whole ideal. Many forms of better attention are borrowed before they are owned. Someone else teaches the pace at which a question can be asked without contempt. Someone else shows that an admission does not always end in humiliation. Someone else interrupts a spiral before it becomes law. Later, that steadier way of looking may become part of one's own inner equipment. Even attention has a history. It grows in company before it can stand alone. The importance of this should not be exaggerated into cure. Attention will not settle the metaphysics of free will. It will not restore lost time. It will not undo a cruel word once spoken. It simply names one way a finite person participates in what happens next. And that participation points toward the most honest synthesis available here. If the self was never self-created, what could choosing well still mean? The image that has been waiting beneath this whole conversation is simple. Thread on a spindle crossing an open hand. Not a clenched fist claiming total ownership. Not a hand hanging absent from the work. An open hand in contact with something already wound, already under tension, already moving according to a pattern not invented in that instant. This is close to what a bounded understanding of agency looks like. We are not outside the thread. We do not grasp the whole spindle. We did not twist the first fibers. A life is shaped before it becomes reflective. Body, era, class, family speech, remembered tenderness, remembered neglect, talent, limitation, public events, private shocks, bodily chemistry, opportunities, losses, institutions, and the accidents of being born where and when one was born, all enter before adult philosophy begins. If one wants a final proof of free will or a final proof of fate, that image will disappoint. It solves nothing grandly, yet it tells the truth more gently than extremes do. The hand is not everything. The hand is not nothing. Stoic assent belongs in that hand. So does tragic humility about ignorance. So do compatibilist distinctions between force and reflective action. So does skepticism about ultimate blame. So do habit, attention, answerability, and repair. None of these make the person the first author of being. Together they describe the forms of participation available to a finite creature living among causes. Choosing well, under this description, is not standing above the chain and issuing immaculate commands. It is participating more clearly in the part of the chain that passes through judgments, habits, reasons, speech, and care. It is noticing where appearance is trying to become verdict too quickly. It is refusing to call coercion freedom. It is refusing to call influence destiny. It is refusing to call causation excuse. It is refusing to call randomness salvation. It is also accepting a certain sorrow. Some forms of authorship will never be ours. No human being will finally be able to say, "I created the self from which all my choices came." The wish to say that is understandable. It is also beyond the condition of being human. A calmer dignity begins when that impossible demand loosens. Once that loosening happens, moral ambition becomes less theatrical and more exact. The aim is no longer to become a spotless origin. It is to become less available to one's worst inheritance, less available to panic as command, less available to vanity dressed as principle, less available to numbness when repair is still possible, more available to truth, to proportion, to steadier forms of care. That may sound smaller than the dream of pure freedom. In lived experience, it is often much harder and much more valuable. Then other questions become more important. What sort of causes am I strengthening? What kind of person is this repetition making? What interpretation am I endorsing by returning to it? What truth do I owe the people I have affected? What limits should I accept because my own patterns are not harmless? What conditions help me act more lucidly next time? These are not metaphysically pure questions, they are moral ones. Perhaps this is why ancient and modern thought keep circling back to the same human scene. Someone living forward under conditions they did not choose, yet still unable to escape the feeling that what they do matters. That feeling is not naive. It may be one of the ways truth announces itself from within limited creatures. We matter not because we are exempt from causes, but because causes pass through beings who can hear reasons, offer accounts, cultivate habits, protect others, and interrupt what they inherited. The image of thread and hand protects against both pride and despair. Pride says the hand spins the whole world. Despair says the hand is decorative, with no role except to be dragged along. The calmer thought says the hand is real, responsive, situated, answerable, and finite. That calm thought also protects us from a common confusion about acceptance. Acceptance is not passive agreement with everything that has shaped you. It is clarity about the conditions under which refusal must operate. A person accepts that they are easily flooded by humiliation, then arranges a slower conversation instead of a public confrontation. A person accepts that alcohol has become a path to dishonesty, then stops keeping it close. A person accepts that praise seduces them into performance, then practices quieter forms of work. None of this is surrender. It is strategy made honest by self-knowledge, and when self-knowledge becomes practical in that way, the image of the hand stops being decorative. The hand is where arrangement happens. The hand chooses which tools stay near, which rooms are entered, which conversations are postponed, which truths are spoken before the old disguise can gather itself. It cannot command the whole loom. It can still make certain futures easier and others harder. That is a modest power. It is also the kind of power from which most worthwhile lives are actually made. That finitude is not an insult. It may be the only frame within which seriousness and compassion can live together. Once people stop demanding from themselves the impossible status of self-created beings, they can begin asking better questions about maintenance, confession, repair, and form. How does a life become more hospitable to truth? How does it become less governed by the first panic, the oldest hunger, the inherited reflex to disappear or dominate? These are fate questions translated into daily practice. The answer will never be a clean doctrine because the sources of constraint are many. Some are bodily, some are social, some are historical, some are intimate and secret, but the practical thread running through the whole night remains consistent. Conditions shape us, judgments matter, ignorance matters, habits matter, other people matter, institutions matter. The future is partly received and partly prepared. A human being does not command the whole loom. A human being can still influence what passes through their own hands. There is a final practical consequence worth naming. If choosing well means participating more lucidly in the causes that pass through you, then lucidity itself becomes a moral achievement. Not brilliance, not invulnerability, lucidity, the ability to notice what is happening in motive before it hardens into action, the ability to hear when a principle is being borrowed to disguise vanity, the ability to tell the difference between accepting limits and worshipping them. None of these capacities puts the self outside the thread, but each one makes the hand on the thread steadier. Lucidity also changes how we meet one another. It makes us slower to worship success and slower to despise failure. It makes room for discernment without cruelty. It asks harder questions about what has formed a person and still insists that the person's conduct matters. In that sense, lucidity is not only private insight, it is a social ethic. It is one of the few ways seriousness and mercy stop behaving like enemies. It also changes what hope sounds like. Hope becomes less like waiting for a new self to arrive from nowhere, and more like trusting that clearer participation is possible. A clearer apology, a clearer refusal, a clearer boundary, a clearer naming of hunger before hunger disguises itself as principle, a clearer recognition that one old fear is trying to write the whole future again. None of these are dramatic enough to satisfy the dream of total reinvention. All of them are strong enough to redirect a life. When the hand steadies, even briefly, the thread does not become simple. It does become less ruled by whatever once moved through it unquestioned. For that reason, choosing well is often inseparable from choosing slowly enough to see what is claiming necessity. Old fear loves speed, vanity loves speed, shame loves speed. So does the wish to end discomfort before the mind has asked what the discomfort is trying to make us do. Slowness will not solve every danger. Some situations demand immediate action, but much of what damages a life happens in the space where inherited reflex outruns examination by only a few seconds. If the hand can pause there, if only briefly, an entire future can bend a little, not because fate vanished, but because one live thread was felt before it tightened into the only possible motion. That brief pause is small enough to be missed by anyone looking for spectacle. It is still where many lives start to change. A new sentence enters. An old sentence is not obeyed. One needless repetition fails to complete itself. Many futures begin there, quietly, before anyone is ready to call the change dramatic. That is enough to carry us into the closing without pretending the problem is solved. What remains is to return to the room where this began, and to ask what changes when an old choice is seen under this light. The room is still quiet. The old decision may still come back tonight. The point is not to silence it with a slogan. The point is to look at it more truthfully. Some of what shaped that choice was never chosen. Temperament, fear, family language, class pressure, bodily exhaustion, old loyalties, habits of avoidance, missing knowledge, all of that may have been present before the final moment arrived. That belongs to the truth, but another truth belongs with it. The action was not therefore nothing. It still passed, in some degree, through judgment, through speech, through assent, through the person who had to live it. That is why the most useful question may no longer be, was it fully free or fully fated? Better questions begin to appear. What was already shaping the choice before I saw it? What part of the act still passed through me? What pattern did it reveal? What can be repaired now? What conditions would have to change if the next similar moment were not to go the same way? Responsibility looks different under that light. It becomes less like cosmic desert and more like answerability, more like telling the truth about what happened, more like repairing what can be repaired, more like accepting limits where one's own pattern is not harmless, more like helping form the self that will meet the next hard moment. The old dream of total freedom flatters dignity. The old dream of total fate flatters exhaustion. One says, I could have been untouched by all of this. The other says, none of this was ever mine. Both dreams hide part of the truth. A human being is shaped and shaping, caused and causing, limited and still morally awake. That is why the image of the open hand matters. The hand does not own the whole thread. It also is not absent from it. It can tighten, steady, release, tangle, or guide what passes through. The spindle carries more history than the hand can command. The hand still belongs to the work. If the question returns in tired hours, perhaps it returns for a good reason. Daylight rewards simplification. Night asks whether the life being lived is also being understood. It asks whether fate is being used to avoid sorrow or freedom to avoid history. It asks whether blame has become too easy or excuse too cheap. Philosophy cannot finish that argument once and for all. It can do something smaller and more honest. It can leave the mind with better distinctions, less vanity, less cruelty, and more care about what is being repeated. It can remind us that conditions matter, habits matter, attention matters, other people matter, and the next choice is never made by a person who came from nowhere. It can also leave a person with one practical form of courage, not the courage of pretending to be self-made, the courage of seeing what has been shaping you without immediately turning that knowledge into excuse or self-hatred, the courage of naming a pattern before it reaches for another victim, the courage of asking for help before the old habit has finished writing the next scene, the courage of small alterations that do not look heroic and yet slowly change what the future can ask of you. That may be as close as wisdom gets on a subject like this. Not a verdict delivered from above the chain, but a steadier way of living within it. Enough honesty to stop calling every limit destiny. enough humility to stop calling every success self-creation, enough care to know that what is repeated becomes easier, what is attended to becomes larger, and what is repaired can keep one old injury from becoming the law of a whole life. The hand is open, the thread is real. Much of it was already wound before you touched it, and still how you touch it matters.